This is the first time I'm posting anything online about this. I'm a 31-year-old woman, married, and recently moved back in with my parents due to moving back to the town I grew up. My husband and I are taking our time looking for our own place due to wanting something nice in the area and that is usually hard to find. This story takes place in my parents' house, starting back 10 years ago. A description of the house for a bit of content. It's a 2-story, brick and stone house in city limits, but still surrounded by nothing but woods. You have to go through a garage that leads into the kitchen with the first bedroom to your left. Past the kitchen is the main living room, and to the right is the hall that is very open. In this area you will find the main dining room and a second living area, but if you continue straight, you will see the staircase to your left, and even further straight is my parents' bedroom and bathroom. Going up the stairs you will come to the third living area. Yes, this is a huge house, with 2 sets of French doors side by side that lead to the outside balcony. Going straight, the A-sharp leads you to the other 3 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms. This is where the story takes place. The first time I stepped foot into this house, I immediately felt off, like something just wasn't right. I felt a presence, but I didn't know what or who it was. I brushed it off thinking I was just reading too much into it. I continued to feel this for the next couple of years, and because of this, I didn't much enjoy visiting them. My parents liked to gamble a lot back then, so they would ask me to babysit my baby brother and sister one day on the weekend. My boyfriend, now husband, loved them, so he would always babysit with me. The first few times I didn't really pay attention to the feeling I would get because we would be busy playing or eating with the kids. After that, things kind of chilled out and we would end up watching movies until it was time for us to go to bed. Now my husband is a freak of nature. It's like he falls asleep the second his eyes are closed. Me, on the other hand, takes me forever to get comfortable enough to wind down my mind. I also don't sleep well even when I do finally get to sleep. This night was the first time I saw and heard something in this brand new house. In this room, the bed is facing the doorway, but not directly in front of it. With the double doors open, you can see the front of the staircase and all the way down the hallway, as long as the light is on, that is. This night, only one of the hallway lights were on. I was laying in bed with the TV on, but the volume down low so I could hear if one of the kids called me. I was almost asleep when I hear one of my siblings come down the stairs. I open my eyes a bit and wait for them to go to the bottom, but they never do. I don't think anything of it, close my eyes and begin to drift off again. A few minutes later I hear again, so I open my eyes and wait, but again never get to the bottom. This time I sit up and listen, a bit spooked but nothing I cannot handle. I get a bit nervous, but still I go to check to see if they are there, and maybe they are scared to come all the way down or something. No one is there. Confused and thinking I must be dreaming it up, I go back to bed, this time closing one of the double doors. It was a few hours later, around 2:30 a.m., when I feel like someone is very near me, as if they are standing next to the bed right in front of me. Usually I open my eyes, I would see the green glow of the alarm clock on the bedside table, but this time I saw nothing. It was pitch black. I couldn't even see the hallway light on, and the TV had turned off on its own. I felt like I couldn't move. I was awake now and scared to my bones. I was finally able to call out my husband's name loud enough to wake him. He reached over and turned on the light, and right then the scared feeling went away and I was able to move. I freaked out and started crying. I couldn't begin to explain to him what happened because even if I had, he didn't believe in those things. So I told him I was having a nightmare and asked him to go check on the kids. When he came back, he said the kids were fine and got back in bed. With the light on, I was able to fall to sleep, but it took me forever. The next day I told my mom about what had happened, and that's when she told me. She had been hearing footsteps on the stairs at night and even saw someone standing by the door at times. She didn't tell anyone because she didn't want to scare the kids. This is when she told me what she had done. She wanted to know what was going on in her house, so she went and bought a voice recorder. One day she decided to use it and went upstairs while everyone was gone. She asked her typical questions of who is here, what do you want, and why are you here? And then said, "You have passed away and need to go into the light. You are not welcome here." The next day she decided to leave the recorder in one of the bedrooms upstairs while it was recording for about 4 hours while she was out running errands. I asked if she had checked it, and to my surprise she said she was too afraid to listen to it alone. I wanted to listen to it. Off we went to the computer and began listening to it after it was uploaded. During the 4 hours she was gone, you could hear something clicking or tapping, sounds of a drawer opening and closing, but we weren't for sure. Then we listened to the part where she was asking questions. Now you could hear a sound that resembled a fan or maybe static throughout the whole thing, so some sounds were indistinguishable. But the one sound we did hear chilled us to the core. When she asked, "What do you want?" it gave us an answer. The answer was Jamie. It didn't answer any other questions except for that one. I cried immediately. He wasn't having night terrors for no reason. Something was there for him every night. We soon asked a friend to cleanse the house. For a long time everything had been okay. My brother had stopped having night terrors. My mom was able to sleep comfortably and all was good again. Until now. I've been living in this house for a month and a half. For the last 3 weeks I've been seeing things everywhere, especially when I'm alone. Because of this, I won't stay alone anymore. I get the strong feeling of being watched. I had the feeling of someone pulling on my blanket at night. I think it's time for another cleanse. Oh, and just for your information, I am the 3rd generation on my mother's side of the family that is able to see spirits. My dad's side of the family has, in the past before I was born, practiced black magic. I don't like speaking to them, and I won't dabble in any of the spiritual stuff most people do. I stay as far away from it as possible, and I recommend that you do too. Even if you are careful, these spirits can haunt you for a long time, even after you are gone. A little update. So I'm sitting in the living room floor playing with my nephew. Mom's on the left couch and sister is on the right couch. My nephew has a toy piano that is made of cloth and can be folded up. This piano is behind us in the corner with all my nephew's other toys. We are talking and watching my nephew attempt to walk when this piano makes a sound. It's like someone is pressing the keys slowly. We stop and stare and then look at each other shocked. Then the keys are pressed rapidly until it finally shuts off on its own. Mom and I are not scared. My sister is terrified due to something happening to her last night around midnight. This story is not about a ghost or an encounter with a creepy stranger. It's not even about a near-death experience or something like that. As a matter of fact, I was never in danger during the event I'm about to tell you. Nonetheless, it's a disturbing memory that I will carry with me until the day I die. I grew up in a small city, the kind of place you could barely call a town if it wasn't for the sheer number of people living there. Downtown was only a couple of blocks long, and in the middle of it was one of the biggest buildings in the area. It was a local movie theater named after the city. I remember going there when I was very young, about 7 years old, and watching the first Pokemon movie. It was probably nothing compared to the theaters we have nowadays, but back then it was huge for me. I loved it. So when a few years later I heard the cinema was going out of business, I felt really sad about it. The building was sold to a religious group that used it for their services. You know the type, loud music, big crowds with their arms in the air singing prayers. Some having seizures on stage while the pastor yells through a mic. Every time I walked past the old cinema, I would see the announcements of the congregation where the movie posters would have been, and if they were in session, you could hear them singing from the other side of the street. This group owned the cinema for nearly a decade, until the local government bought back the building in order to restore it as a historic landmark of the city. When this happened, I was studying construction with the intent to follow architecture or civil engineering at college, and my class was very lucky to be involved with the cinema's restoration project because 2 of our teachers were architects working on it. I will always remember the day when we went to visit the old cinema. Our class was small, only a handful of students, but we were all around the same age, so we all shared childhood memories of when the cinema was operational. We ran through the corridors of the auditorium, sat in the chairs just like we did when we were little kids, and began stomping on the wooden floor with our feet, filling the entire room with echoes of our drumming and laughters. A little ritual or sorts everyone used to do right before the beginning of the movie. Once nostalgia time was over, we went back to the purpose of the trip and began to survey the building. We were very excited because that was a unique opportunity to go into the places we would have never been allowed to otherwise. So we made sure to check every last corner, every single room, no matter how far, no matter how obscure. The first one we found was below the stage. On one of the corners there was a little door, not very visible, probably because it was meant for maintenance staff only. Behind it we found a long room filled with rusty boilers, part of the old heating system that was no longer in use. The place was a little creepy with all those old tanks and pipes crowding the narrow space, but what we found past them was what really started to freak us out. This room was small, very small. It was, after all, basically just a leftover space behind the boilers. Yet it contrasted so much with the rest of the area around it. It may as well have been from a different place altogether. The walls were painted a light color, white I think, but I don't remember it being very well because what really got my attention were the drawings in them. There were rainbows, a smiling sun, trees and flowers, and happy little people with smiles on their faces of dotted eyes. It was a daycare. The whole class and teacher gathered to see the discovery. We were all very confused about the strange placing of this room. Okay, we could understand the need for a place to keep the kids that were too little to be amongst the crowd during prayers, or maybe the ones of the people who worked there, but the placing was just odd. The stage was probably one of the loudest places in the auditorium during the services, and this was right below it, so there was no way it could be a quiet place for the children. We left the boiler room and continued our tour through the theater, a little puzzled about our finding but not giving it too much thought. Outside of the auditorium there were bathrooms, both in terrible condition, the ticket sales booth, and a huge set of stairs that led to a mezzanine in the auditorium. Half of the seats there were totally ruined due to a water leak in the roof, and I cursed these people for not taking proper care of the building. With that part done, all that was left was the projection room on the 3rd floor. Behind the tickets booth, there was a door that led to a spiral stair. I don't remember how tall it actually was, but it must have been over 10 meters of metallic steps without a single resting spot. I wasn't exactly an athlete, but I could walk several kilometers with no problem and rode on a bike to and from school every single day. Yet by the time I reached the top of the stairs, I was exhausted. And I wasn't the only one. All of my classmates complained about how hard it was to walk up there. After a short break to catch our breath, we moved on to explore the 3rd floor. It was roughly a narrow passageway with a couple of divisions to form different rooms, but it was more than enough for what it was made for. The first room from the stairs was a storage deposit, probably where they kept the movies and other equipment, and except for some trash, it was mostly empty. The second room was the one we were all excited to see, the projector room. The old machine was so big that it was still there, and there were even some pieces scattered around. It was quite a piece of history, and we were all very thrilled to check it out, so no one really bothered to move on to the very last room until we were about to leave. And there we saw it again. There was a train in this one instead of a rainbow. Something was written on it, in big, colorful letters. Something about Christ. I can't remember it well. The drawings were a bit old, paint slightly peeled from the walls, but the colors were just as cheerful as you would expect for a place where children play. My heart sank to my stomach as I came to a realization of what the place really was. The one behind the boilers probably serving the same purpose. I took notice of how isolated that room was, literally the furthest away you could possibly get from everyone else. I thought about the 3 floors of stairs and imagined what it would have been like to a child to walk all the way up, only to end up in that room. The room with that colorful train in the wall. My classmates and I exchanged horrified expressions as I knew they were thinking the same. We never visited the theater again, even though we continued with the restoration project for several months. We never talked about those 2 rooms. Cases of molestation in the church are well known by everyone, to the point that the pedo priest is practically a cliche. But this is the kind of thing you think happens in some place far away, in another city, even in another country. You never imagine it can happen in the very same town you live, the place where you grew up, in the very same building where you once watched a Pokemon movie when you were 7 years old. So about 3 years ago, I was taking a year off from college and was back in my tiny hometown in the Midwest. I had a lot of friends in the area and we used to love to go out in the groves, abandoned buildings, and anywhere else to shoot coons, skunks, possums, and the occasional coyote. Yes, it was a pretty redneck pastime, but we also got paid for it. One night, I think it was about late March or early April, like spring was right around the corner but there was still snow on the ground. About 6 of us went to an old abandoned house a decent way from town. As we drove up to it, it looked like your average abandoned house. Tall grass all over the yard, including the driveway, broken windows, etc. As we all got out of the truck, we noticed that there was a female mannequin head tied by her hair on a windowsill on the 2nd story. We ignored it and started moving to the front door, which we quickly discovered was locked. Now this is where I usually like to call it and find somewhere else to go, but one of my friends just crawled through a broken window and let us in. Right off the bat, something was wrong. Although there was no furniture or anything else that would show a living person was occupying the house, there was also no dust. I pointed that out and was just told to stop being a bitch by my friends. We walked through the main floor and didn't find anything, and then we checked out the basement. The basement was full of mason jars, like easily 1,000 of them, probably more. I said something was definitely up and we needed to get the F out, but once again my friends told me to man up. They smashed a few of them before I convinced them to go upstairs and check that out. We climbed back up to the main floor and then to the 2nd story. When we got up to the top level, I split off from the rest of the group, pulled out a knife, and cut the mannequin head down. I was looking at it in my hand when my friends called out to me and told me to check out what they found. I ran to them and found about 3 sleeping bags, some old bikes, lots of shoes, and lots of Mountain Dew bottles. Some of these bottles were frozen, and some were not. This is where we all decided it was time to get out of this house. Once out of the house, we waited in our pickup while we decided where to go next. But we figured no one was at the house at the time, so we would do a quick sweep of the barn and corn crib and then leave. We went to a shed quick and shined a light in it, didn't see anything, and headed for the corn crib. I'm not sure why, but I was walking alone to the crib, with one friend following me about 15 feet, and 6 others stayed at the shed for some reason. I was getting close to the crib, but I had my eyes on my gun. I was just checking it over to make sure everything was right when my friend shouted, "Holy shit, I just saw something move through the window on the 2nd story." He then ran up to me and took out a flashlight and shined it at the window. I didn't see anything, but a glimmer of light caught my eye on the main story. I shined my light into the main floor of the crib and there was blood everywhere. Just typing this, I'm getting goosebumps all over. There was blood coming down the wall from the second story, all over the wall and starting to drip onto the floor. It wasn't even starting to coagulate. Got the hell out of there ASAP, as my friends saw it from the shed they were still at. Later that year, in June or so, I told that story to a girl I liked, and she didn't believe me. We ended up getting into my truck, driving to the house in the middle of the day, and I put my high beams on the crib without ever getting out of the truck, and the dried blood was still there. But it didn't look like any more ever came from the second story. The summer after, the bar next to the corn crib burned down. The sheriff department said a moonshine installment went wrong and people operating it fled the area. I still have no idea why there was so much blood. It wasn't mentioned in the report at all. I was 17 and working at my first job stocking items at a grocery store. Very mundane, but it allowed me for some freedom. I'd had a few run-ins with random odd people, but nothing I couldn't handle. About 2 months in, I'm shelving on the lowest level in the canned food aisle, and a very tall man comes to hover over me, so close his knees are touching my back. I told myself it was a coincidence and said, "Excuse me." Try to slide sideways out of his way, but he steps around me, trapping me. Tried a few more times to the same result when he crouches down and asks if I've ever had a full body massage. My heart was racing and I was panicked, but like an idiot I froze up, while the guy proceeds to roughly rub my shoulders. At that moment, a coworker popped her head around the corner to see how I was getting along and surprised him. He waved a hand and goes, "Hi," like it was normal. I booked it to the back and told my manager, who in turn told security, who saw him out. I wish it had ended there, but me being, which obviously means stupid, and I was going through a major grown-up/independent streak, had myself a good cry and then refused all offers to go home for the day. I also wanted to talk to the police when they got there. A little over an hour later, still no police. I hear a bunch of ruckus and shouting. Then someone yelled my name, and I went to investigate. It was a coworker trying to tell me to get to the back, but he'd come back with a baseball bat and a Rottweiler looking for me. The pair of them quickly march over to me, all the while the dog is snarling, and he's saying how the dog likes me. He knew it would. I must be good with animals, and he would finish that massage back at his place. I got pinned, but my manager, one of the best women I've ever met, somehow gets herself between me and the dog this guy keeps, not asking, not telling, but commanding me to pet. She stayed there holding on to me behind her back until finally the police get there. After a brief but tense standoff, he's arrested the dog, taken to the pound. I sensibly went home. Several months later, long enough for me to all but have forgotten everything, my manager calls me into her office. She said she wanted to be there when I found out and handed me a newspaper. It took me way too long to register what was so important. The man had been arrested for murder and kidnapping. We both started crying and I went home for the day. I couldn't handle it and wound up leaving shortly after. I think the creepiest, scariest part was how calm he was during the whole thing. Even after the officers got there and his dog started losing its shit, he was just so very, very calm and normal looking, like this was a normal thing. I was in Portland, Oregon about 6 months ago for training at work. A bunch of coworkers and I went out drinking the last night we were there. They ended up going home before me and I found myself trying to find my way home around 3:30 a.m. with a dead phone. There's a large homeless population in Portland, many of which I passed sleeping on the sidewalk under shop entrances. At one point I come across a bus stop and what appears to be a little old woman bent over looking for something in her purse. I ask her if she knows which direction my hotel is in, and she whirls around, and I notice her teeth are rotting and they look as if they are sharpened at the end, most likely from decay. She had leathery tan skin, frizzy white hair, and these terrifying light blue eyes that were open as wide as they would go. She lets out a scream at the top of her lungs, not like a scared scream, but like a terrifying witch scream, and says,
"Don't go down that road back there. There's a man with a knife and he's not a good person. Don't go down there. Don't go, he is bad."
She just stands there wide-eyed, repeating that over and over, yelling at my face. I listened for about 5 seconds before I took off the other direction, about to shit my pants. I looked back about a block away and she was still there yelling to me. Most terrifying encounter I've ever experienced. My friend and I experienced missing time, so to speak, while on a canoe trip. About 10 years ago, my friend and I went on a trip to Quetico Provincial Park in Ontario. Quetico is a wilderness park, so there's no car camping or any sort of facilities like that. You get your permit and put it at your entry point. The amount of permits given out is limited to preserve the park, so it's unlikely that you will run into any other people during your trip, maybe a ranger. We put in at Beaver House and our route took us south into the Boundary Waters, a wilderness park in Minnesota. We chose our route poorly and ended up having to take a grueling 8-kilometer portage. We weren't properly packed or light enough to make this portage in one go, which was a big mistake. We also overestimated ourselves and started it too late in the afternoon. I've done many portages before, but this was something else. It had it all. Canadian Shield gnarled roots, rocks and moss, flooded marshland, huge smooth granite saddles, dense humus soil that sucked your boots in, the works. Don't know how long it took exactly, but I'd say at least an hour and a half each way. It didn't help that our canoe was fairly heavy. We tried to save a few bucks by not renting a Kevlar one and used my friend's rubberized canoe that's meant for running rapids. Thankfully, it was tough because I must have dropped it at least 50 times, but you can just kick the dents out. Anyway, we're on the way back to get the rest of our stuff and make the second trip, practically on the verge of tears from exhaustion, and it's starting to get dark. Not good. We have flashlights, but setting up in the dark sucks. Don't even mention trying to find a campsite. We load up the food and get moving. 10 minutes later, we round a bend and I see some packs in a green canoe. I think, shit, we must have taken a wrong turn and ended up at someone's campsite. But there were no branching trails and no campsites nearby. I take a closer look and realize it's our stuff. But how? We had passed none of the landmarks we had before, like the granite saddles. We were certainly exhausted, but I find it hard to believe that I could zone out from that many kilometers. And what about my friend? He also acknowledged that we finished the portage in an impossibly short time. I looked at the maps thinking maybe we had accidentally taken some alternate trail or loop back before, but there was nothing. Just 8 kilometers of land between the two lakes. Now that I've typed this out, it feels anticlimactic, but there's just simply no explanation for traveling 8 kilometers in 10 minutes. I'm looking at my old maps now to try and find where this occurred exactly. Last year, I was on an outward bound trip in the Rockies on a 14-day expedition. In case you guys aren't hip to the outward bound course, there's a solo about 3/4 of the way through the trip, which is pretty much you're in your own area out of eyeshot and hearing range of other group members for a set amount of time. This expedition had a 2-day one. So on day 11 or so we stopped to do ours. Mind you, this is a 9-day hike from the closest base camp, and we went about a mile off the rugged trail we were taking to set up. I woke up on the second day of the solo and looked out of my tarp and saw a guy about 20 feet away in a solid cherry red hoodie with the hood drawn, strings fully pulled, so his face was entirely covered. I figured this was one of the instructors because they go around sometime on the second day to check on us, so I waved at him and smiled. He then took off uphill and I lost sight in the trees. Come the next day when we were all back and talking about it, I asked which of the instructors had the red hoodie. Turns out neither of them did. There was a man 10,000 feet up a mountain in the middle of the woods who walked by me sleeping in a tent. It had potential to go pretty awry. About 15 or so years ago, when I was 16, I went to visit my aunt and uncle during my summer vacations. They used to live with my family when I was growing up, but had moved to a small hill station when I was 12. Their house, along with the others in the community, was at the foothills of the mountain, while the downtown was about 10 kilometers away, reachable from their house by crossing a bridge over a river. Downtown is where all the shops were, including my uncle's small chemist shop that he operated with the help of a young guy named Kieran, about 23 years old or so. I used to hang out with him whenever I was at the shop. Pretty talkative and friendly guy that lived close to my uncle's house. One afternoon, my aunt asked me to go downtown to grab a few things from the local shops there. She asked me to take the spare scooter that was at their house. Thrilled with the idea of driving, I took the scooter, crossed the bridge, got into downtown, went to a couple of shops and got the stuff. On the way back, I see Kieran walking towards the direction of the bridge. Would have been about 5 p.m. or so at that time. I assumed that he had left early to go home that day. My uncle would shut his shop by 7:30 p.m. I stopped the scooter next to him, say hi and make small talk, except that he barely talks. Just a very basic yes, no answers. After about 10 minutes or so, I eventually ask him if he is heading home, and he says yes. I offer to give him a ride to his place and he accepts. Sits behind me on the scooter and off we go. It's about 5:30 p.m. by now and the light had faded fast. The street lamps were on by the time I reached the bridge. Around the middle of the bridge, I start feeling extremely cold, teeth-shattering cold, but by the time I get to the other end, I'm all okay. So I look back asking Kieran if he felt that cold as well, except, well, he's not there. I stop the scooter right away and look back, and he is simply not there, vanished in the thin air. I know he couldn't have gotten off the scooter when we were crossing the bridge, just not physically possible to get off the scooter while it is being driven, sitting at the back seat. My mind could not comprehend what had happened, and in a daze, I drove the scooter back home, but didn't tell my aunt about the incident. I wasn't sure what had happened. Later that evening, after my uncle came back home, I asked him about Kieran. Found out that no one had seen Kieran for 2 days. He hadn't come to the shop or gone back to his home. It's been 15 years and Kieran has not been found. I do not know who I met that evening, who sat behind me on the scooter, who drove with me halfway through the bridge to simply disappear. So I live and work in a town on Cape Cod that's known for its Native American heritage. I've never believed in spirits or paranormal stuff before this, but what happened that day was observed by our entire crew, which was 4 people total that day. We were clearing a fire access path to get to the river in case of an emergency this particular week. Everything was going normal. It was early morning and we were nearing the end and we had to clear about 100 feet diameter area so a fire truck could turn around, cutting trees and chipping them into a truck. So a short time before break, I look over near the river, and just before the river, about 150 feet away, I see a woman and a child, maybe 4 to 5 years of age. What was interesting was that they were dressed in deerskin clothing. They were clear as day, clearly native. So I turn to my supervisor and tell him to look over there. And as I turn, they're gone. So I thought maybe I'm just seeing things, continue working. Leading up to a break, I get this intense level of sadness that starts building. I felt heavy, depressed, almost like I could cry. It was that intense. We stop for a break and I begin to explain what I saw, and just as this happens, across the river near the top of the trees is an intense ball of light. This is maybe 300 feet away. This ball is huge, like a mini sun, yellow in the middle to a blue around the edges. We all see this light and it starts to move along the trees from our left to the right, and it disappears off into the distance. A minute or two later, we hear a loud drum beating from that direction. Three times. It felt like we shouldn't be there, and as we're walking away, I feel this rush of heat, like there's a fire on my back as we leave.